Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Ramani and welcome back to this series, a sort of glossary of terms related to narcissistic relationships and narcissism. This series came out of my thought that I think a lot of people are like, what does this mean? What does that mean? And some people have never even heard some of these terms. So it was my hope in this series not only to create some clarity and enlightenment, but also maybe open you up to knowledge about this field that may help you understand what your experience has been or understand other things you're reading or hearing. Today, we're going to take on the topic of coercive control. But before we go on, I'm always going to invite you, please consider subscribing to this channel and also hitting the bell to get notifications and hit the word subscribe to subscribe. That will give you the opportunity to also get notifications as more and more content comes out on this topic. So let's take on this topic. Of coercive control. Coercive control has been defined by various people, various sources, as a pattern or a strategy of a person doing things like using acts that include threats, menacing, intimidation, manipulation, stalking, humiliation, isolation, financial abuse, gaslighting, and sometimes physical or sexual abuse. The term coercive control was actually originally crafted by Evan Stark, who has been a major proponent and developer of this model and a key stakeholder in bringing coercive control laws into place in the United Kingdom. Now, the patterns that we observe in coercive control, these patterns are designed to isolate a person and render that person dependent on a partner for financial support, housing, food, and even their connection to the world. Coercive control results in slowly hijacking a person's life, stealing their independence, stealing their ability to take action, and governing every move that they make. It is controlling, it is manipulative, and it is exploitative. A person who is living through or experiencing coercive control lives in constant fear and with constant menace in their life. Domestic violence agencies have termed coercive control a deprivation of human rights and liberties. A study conducted in 2014 by Kelly and her colleagues estimated that 95% of domestic abuse survivors experience some form of coercive control. So, what does this look like? Coercive control looks like lots of things. It looks like threats and intimidation. And sometimes these are vague threats, sometimes they're real, but they're always menacing and unsettling. Better be careful. You never know when I'm going to get you. They isolate you from families, friends, and workplaces. And this can happen gradually. Initially, they'll do this in various ways. They may insult your friends, plant seeds of doubt about their trustworthiness, telling you that your family is trying to sabotage your happiness and your relationship with them, sharing lies with you about your friends and family. And then just as the doubt overwhelms you, they also double down and restrict your access to them, and you may go along after all the mental manipulation. Another form is to isolate a partner from a job. Initially, they'll pitch this as benevolent. I want to take care of you. You deserve for me to take care of you. Stay home. It's okay. I want you to go back to school someday. You need to stay home with the children. And if a person is still working, they manage to still work while being in this kind of relationship, the person engaging in coercive control may actively attempt to influence their workplace relationships or even make them look badly to their employer. And they may insist on dropping off and picking up a partner at work so they cannot talk with coworkers, develop friendships, have support, and so they can monitor their comings and goings. People who engage in coercive control also monitor your time and your whereabouts. And sadly, in a technological era, this is easier than ever. All kinds of things. The sort of find your phone app on a phone, tracking apps that can go on everything, spyware, trackers on cars that they present to you as a generous gift. People who engage in coercive control may do things like restricting normal activity, even things like grocery shopping or medical appointments or school events for your children, or always insist on accompanying you to any of these things. In coercive control, it's very common to see chronic verbal abuse, calling you terrible names, regularly calling you worthless or stupid. They may control access to information and services, and this may involve blocking your access to electronics or putting spyware on electronics, which means that all of your searches are monitored, and all computers and devices in a home might be on one unitary network. It's very common in these situations to see stalking, and this may be them literally following you around or doing it via devices, or getting paid surveillance on you, or asking people who know you, family, friends, people you work with, to provide updates. They'll do things like control basic elements of your environment, where you sleep, what time you go to sleep and wake up, what you are allowed to wear. And these could be experienced as being very restrictive dress codes. They may make demands on whether or not you're allowed to wear makeup, what you're allowed to eat. And one thing that is sometimes observed in coercive control dynamics is that they'll either restrict a partner from eating or force them to eat. Another pattern we'll see is calling, texting, or video calling you constantly attempting to create access, even when you don't want them to. And if you ask them to not interrupt you and stop calling you as much, they will become enraged and call over and over and over again. And then they'll attempt to call other people who may be where you are. They will regularly engage in humiliation, degradation, and dehumanization of you, either when you're alone or when you're in front of other people. A popular trick of the coercive controller is that they'll ask you to FaceTime them or video call them or send them a picture, which I promise you they'll check the timestamp on, and they'll ask you, where are you now? Prove to me where you are now. If you try to send them an old picture, trust me, they'll remember what you wore that morning and they'll know you weren't there. They'll try to control your finances, even if you're working, and limiting access to any banking or credit cards. They will make threats. Again, these threats can be veiled or not veiled. And if they might say something like, hey, if something ever happened to you, I'd get away with it because I know the cops and they'd believe me. It is menacing and it is terrifying. And when you make a comment, they will gaslight you and laugh and get off on the fear that they created in you by making these menacing comments, saying things like, I'm going to ruin your life. They create a climate of fear, which is fostered by having all these sort of arbitrary rules. And they variably enforce these rules. But when they do, they will punish the partner in the home or the children or other people in the home through deprivation of even basic things like food, through humiliation, and through more threats. In coercive control dynamics, it's also not uncommon to see sexual abuse and sexual violence and forced sex, and this can include forcing an unwanted pregnancy so as to be in a better position to control a partner financially, and the dependency fostered by having a child together. They'll engage in constant criticism of everything you do or say. Gaslighting is a very common dynamic in coercive control. And in a word, coercive control is relational imprisonment. There's also a spillover effect on other people because the coercively controlling partner indirectly harms the people around you because they may also, and hopefully they believe you, but they may also be experiencing the same fear, the same sense of grief and loss over not being able to reach out to you, to find you, to be with you when you're being coercively controlled. And then they also have to deal with the irritation of the stalking behavior of the coercive controller and the impact on their lives too. Now, obviously, this dynamic, of all of the dynamics we've discussed, is very dangerous. And tragically, in the cases of coercive control that do not culminate in physical violence or abuse, then many times law enforcement and other authorities will not record this as domestic violence and will not bring about charges or any other protective mechanisms. They'll often write it off as, "Ugh, that's a relationship issue." Now, courageously, the United Kingdom has adopted coercive control laws, which is an important first step. But sadly, the rest of the world lags behind. People, and they are more often women who are in these situations, who find themselves in these kinds of relationships, are often written off by institutions and a whole variety of other pieces of law enforcement as dependent, or have this idea that these people could leave these relationships if they wanted because there's been no violence yet, and yet there are so many obituaries out there of women who were coercively controlled, who tried to get restraining orders and could not get them because it was only psychological abuse. And when they finally did leave, were murdered. But all of you are listening to this and you're saying, wait a minute, this kind of sounds like a relationship with a malignant narcissist. Yeah. And that is how this dynamic of coercive control connects to all this terminology we're discussing related to narcissism and narcissistic relationships. It is also a pattern we observe with psychopathic partners, but given the high level of overlap between psychopathy and a lot of elements of narcissism, we can see this as a pattern that these kinds of personality styles are likely to be the most predominant perpetrators of. So in this way, while I recognize that the work on coercive control has traditionally focused on the behavioral pattern, let's talk about the perpetrators. Let's think about what kind of person would be capable of doing something like this. This would be someone who lacks empathy, someone who's brutally entitled, someone who is incredibly controlling, someone who's motivated by power, someone who can't regulate stress or disappointment and manifests it as rage, someone who's hypersensitive, someone who's arrogant, someone who is deeply insecure. Sound familiar? And when you throw in some paranoia, willful cruelty, charm, and charisma so they can fool the world, there it is. That's malignant narcissism, right? Coercive control, like many of the phenomena we've been talking about, is on a spectrum. Obviously, in the most extreme cases, it is dangerous and it is even lethal. However, even on the milder end of the spectrum, and I'm not even convinced there's any mild form of coercive control, it can become a gradual process of being more and more controlled. And because gaslighting is such a prevalent dynamic in coercive control and in narcissism, the confusion and the self-doubt mean that the isolation and the ongoing psychological abuse slowly overtake a person's life. And because of the isolation, you do not have any sounding boards around you or places to get a reality check. You can't even log into a group and get support. And there also is going to be chronic criticism and humiliation and degradation and mocking you in front of other people and calling you worthless. And that experience on a daily basis is going to take a horrific toll on your mental health. Gaslighting within a coercive control framework, to me, feels like the most abusive form of gaslighting because there's literally almost no way to get a sense of reality. The unwillingness of the world to recognize psychological abuse as being as damaging as physical abuse means that people experiencing this kind of pattern have very few places to turn. They are so often doubted that other than domestic violence programs that are informed about this dynamic, there is so little support. Anyone in a narcissistic relationship, though, all of you, you know the drill. People telling you, oh God, it can't be that bad. He's a big shot in the community. I mean, at least you have a nice house. I mean, gosh, at least he always cares where you are. My guy doesn't even care where I'm at. Or people telling you, relationships are hard. It's all of this gaslighting we get from the world on a regular basis that makes this so hard. Now, the dynamic of coercive control appears to a greater or lesser degree in nearly all relationships with malignant narcissists. In some cases, it may be milder, but these relationships are, by definition, manipulative, exploitative, menacing, confusing, and isolating. The coercive control dynamic can feel even more horrific when the malignant narcissist is charming and confident and charismatic and generous with other people. In that way, they're able to convince other people that he's a great guy. And that leaves you with even less of a likelihood of getting any support. In fact, as you get shredded by this relationship and seem less and less like yourself, others may even go so far as to feel bad for your abuser because you aren't looking that good and anymore and you're not that well put together, and how nice of him to stay with you. It's a mind F word all around. But malignant narcissistic types are not the only narcissistic types who are at risk for perpetrating coercive control, even though they're the most likely. This is a pattern that may also be observed in covert narcissistic patterns. The tendency of covert narcissists towards isolation anyhow means that they may try to suck you into their isolated universe, and they are also prone to dynamics such as control to keep a partner around. In both covert and malignant narcissism, we often also see people who hold and espouse ridiculous and dangerous views on women in relationships and nonsense about how women need to be obedient. Now, if you grew up in a family in which a coercive control dynamic occurred, it will have an impact on you as an adult. These impacts may range from severe anxiety to post-traumatic stress, to regulation issues such as substance abuse. It is incredibly traumatic to grow up this way and to witness a parent being controlled in such a manner and living under the specter of the menace, because coercive controllers also tend to take it out on their children. Now, in the workplace, this dynamic may be less likely. However, if you are in a workplace situation in which you are vulnerable for reasons of things like legal paperwork, like, for example, immigration reasons, or you're in a coercive labor situation, or in a new culture where you may not be as familiar with languages or rules, or a person, for example, who's in a labor trafficking situation, coercive control often can and does show up with all of the same harms and risks, including things like indentured wages, having to pay money back to somebody for transporting you into that situation, and having no recourse, such as labor laws. Or if it's a residential situation where you live, where you work, these abuses can leave you isolated, and your communications may be monitored by your employer and other tools that you could use to get out, such as cell phones or passports, taken away. Now, control is consistently a part of the narcissistic relationship dynamic, and it tends to be an element in all of these kinds of relationships. However, when this control is at the level of coercive control, there is no mincing it. It is abuse. There is no excusal, and hopefully someday, more and more regions of the world are going to recognize this as the rule of law. For now, I'm not holding my breath. But to talk about coercive control and not talk about narcissism misses the picture. And as always, we know these patterns don't change, especially when they are this severe. So a person in this situation is in danger, often grave danger. And this can be psychologically, physically, and quite often, it's both. If you do want to take a deeper dive into coercive control, because it's a very complex topic, please consider looking at Evan Stark's book. It's called Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life. You know, I was on the fence about bringing this term of coercive control into the glossary. And as I was reading more about it recently, I recognize that coercive control really comes down to being, honestly, like a bit of a summary of what happens in many relationships with malignant narcissists. Now, please note, if in the United States, if you are experiencing abuse, please contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE or 1-800-799-7233, or go to their website, hotline.org. But if you are experiencing coercive control, it is very likely your devices are being monitored. So if it's possible, please find a third-party device, such as a friend's device, a workplace device, or a library to use, or ask someone to look into this for you. If you are outside of the United States, please explore options regionally that might involve an NGO or other regional agencies that address domestic abuse, or use any points of contact you can with someone who may be able to garner assistance. To me, this dynamic of coercive control really reflects that this isn't just that these narcissistic relationships aren't just about sometimes what feel like trivial concerns that pile up over time. These are dangerous. It's dangerous for partners, it's dangerous for children, and it's dangerous for other people around this family. Sometimes the controlling dynamics of narcissistic relationship don't seem like much initially. In fact, a lot of people misinterpret the early control as, they must be really into me, they must be really interested. Control and human relationships should not go together. As soon as you feel that sense of being over-monitored, you sense, even if it feels like flattery, it's not. Control is unhealthy. This is what it can culminate into. I hope this has given you some clarity on this term coercive control, which some of you may or may not have been familiar with. I thank you again for tuning in. In this video description, those resources will also be highlighted if you need to go back and get those numbers or those websites. Thank you again for tuning in.